Start it." The voice cut through the air dry cold, as if this were nothing more than a bit of amusement. The young captain stood in front of the A-10, pointing straight at the aircraft's fuselage with a thin smirk. The old man had just been telling a few young airmen stories from long ago, about flying these iron birds, about taking them into combat. So surely, he still remembered which switches to flip right, or had all this modern technology become too much for him now? The veteran, well into his 80s, did not answer. He stood very close to the nose landing gear, one hand resting calmly on the thick, worn rubber, as if this were not a display aircraft at all, but a familiar part of his life that had never truly left him. Nearby, a few young airmen exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. The captain took another step closer, his voice lower now, sharper. "Come on, Grandpa. Start the A-10. Show everyone what you've got." The old veteran remained silent. No explanations, no resistance, no retreat. He simply stood there so calm that the air itself seemed to grow heavier, as if that silence were quietly challenging every word that had just been spoken. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, please subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our heroes. Henry did not look at the captain. He did not look at the crowd gathering behind him either. His gaze settled on the nose of the A-10, just beneath the cockpit, where the paint had darkened with age. There, the 7 barrels of the GAU-8 appeared in his mind, not as an image but as a familiar sensation etched deep into his body. A heavy dry shock slammed straight into his chest, a sound he did not need to hear with his ears because it had never left his bones. He remembered the feeling of the aircraft shuddering beneath his hands, the entire metal frame seeming to brace itself against the very force it unleashed. It was not a heroic memory. There were no flags, no shouts, only weight, the savage growl of metal, and a single thought. If he stopped, someone down there would not make it home. Henry blinked once, very slowly. He did not try to remember. Those things had never needed names. They were there like breathing, like a heartbeat, like the dull aches that surfaced whenever the weather turned cold. He stood still, his hand resting on the nose landing gear, feeling the familiar firmness of rubber that had absorbed thousands of landings. A rare sense of solidity in a world where everything else had changed too fast. Around him, silence spread, not out of respect, but out of unease. A few young airmen glanced at one another, their eyes uncertain. They saw an old man standing beside a machine of war, and they did not know what they were supposed to feel. Curiosity, discomfort, pity. No one had ever taught them how to respond to someone who had lived longer than the stories in their textbooks. A young voice rose hesitant, as if even the speaker was unsure he had the right to speak. "Sir, maybe we shouldn't..." The sentence was cut off before it could finish. The captain replied immediately without turning his head, without lowering his voice. "Stay out of it. He likes telling war stories. He should be able to back them up." The words were short, sharp, and loud enough for everyone to hear. Henry heard every word clearly. He did not react, not because he did not understand, but because he had heard words like these his entire life, in different forms, in different places. When he was young, they came from the enemy. When he was old, they came from the impatience of those who had never paid the price for what they mocked. He exhaled slowly, not a sigh of anger, the breath of exhaustion. Tired of standing before questions he did not need to answer. Tired of existing in a world that only believed in what could be proven instantly. Tired of knowing that some things once spoken aloud lost half their value. In that moment, Henry was no longer on the base, no longer in the present. He was not thinking about numbers, medals, or mission reports. He thought of voices that had once crackled through his headset, shaking urgent, sometimes managing only to call out a unit name before the signal vanished. He thought of turning back when no one would have advised it, not out of heroism, simply because it was what needed to be done. He stood still the way he once stood still before pushing the control stick forward, not waiting for orders, not waiting for permission. Just standing there carrying everything he had lived through and letting the silence speak for what remained. And it was within that silence, when no one spoke up to defend him, when no one stepped forward to stop it, that mockery began to seep in slowly but unmistakably, preparing to tear apart the already taut air. Cole tilted his head, his gaze settling on the faded patch on Henry's jacket. A small piece of fabric frayed at the edges, its sand-colored thread so pale it nearly blended into the worn leather beneath it. He raised his hand and pointed straight at it, making no effort to hide his contempt. What's that supposed to be? Cole's voice lifted slightly. A veterans bingo club. A brief pause followed. Then a few laughs broke out. Not loud, not confident. Half-formed, awkward laughs, but laughter nonetheless. Enough to shift the air. Enough to turn a private jab into a public humiliation. Enough to signal that the crowd had been given permission. Henry heard it all. He did not lower his head. He did not turn away. For the first time since the confrontation began, he slowly raised his eyes and looked directly at Cole. There was no anger, no hurt. Only the gaze of someone who had gone far enough that he had nothing left to prove. A calm, stone-heavy look that made the laughter fall out of rhythm the moment it faded. In that instant, Cole sensed a change, though he could not name it. Not fear, but the uneasy feeling of being seen through. Still, he did not stop. Those accustomed to power rarely stop at the right moment. Henry spoke. His voice was low, slightly rough, never raised, never lecturing. The auxiliary power unit has to be checked on the ground first. He paused briefly. Hydraulic pressure needs to stabilize at 3,000 psi. Then he continued, slow and precise. You don't just turn a key. The air seemed to lock in place. A few young airmen glanced at one another. There was something in the way he spoke that did not sound like boasting. No theatrics. No competition. Just a fact set down solid and compact like an object long familiar to the hand. Cole hesitated. Only half a beat. A moment so small it almost went unnoticed, yet large enough to reveal surprise. Then he laughed louder than before, as if volume alone could crush the feeling that had surfaced. Right. Real expert. He shook his head. Listen, sir. This is a restricted area. His tone shifted slower, clearer, like someone speaking to a person he assumed was no longer fully aware. Show me your pass. That sentence was no longer mockery. It carried authority. It drew an invisible line into place. In that moment, Henry was no longer just an old man standing beside an aircraft. He was pushed into a different role. An outsider. Someone required to prove his right to be there. Henry looked at Cole once more. His expression did not change. But something settled very deep inside him. He was used to being misunderstood. Yet this insult was not aimed at his age. It was aimed at his dignity, at his right to stand beside the memories he had traded his youth to earn. The crowd no longer laughed. They stood still. No one stepped forward. No one objected. This silence was different from before. It was no longer awkwardness. It was avoidance. The moment when people realize they are witnessing something wrong and lack the courage to intervene. Henry did not answer immediately. He was not in a hurry. He knew that from this moment on, every word would carry a different weight. What had begun as a joke had crossed a personal boundary. It had become a public test of power of memory and of who was allowed to stand where. And it was precisely when that demand was spoken, when humiliation put on the uniform of command, that the wheels of an irreversible chain of events began to turn. The crowd began to thicken quietly. Families walking past slowed their steps. Soldiers stopped where they stood. Mechanics lingered farther back, yet no one looked away from the focal point taking shape. This was no longer curiosity, nor was it outrage, at least not yet. It was the feeling people get when they realize they are standing inside a moment they will remember later, even though no one knows how to intervene. Cole's voice changed. The mockery was gone. The joking disappeared. It dropped lower, harder, carrying the authority granted by rank. Empty your pockets slowly. The words came out short and final, like an order long accustomed to being obeyed. One of Cole's hands shifted instinctively toward his waist. Not out of fear, but from the reflex of someone used to controlling situations. Henry heard him clearly. He did not flinch. He did not react the way those around him expected. He simply slipped his hand into his jacket. Slowly. Calmly. No tremor. No hesitation. The movement did not resemble compliance under pressure, but the practiced action of someone long accustomed to operating under stress, where every motion had to be deliberate, precise. In that instant, the crowd's attention tightened like a drawn wire. No one spoke. No one laughed. Every gaze fixed on the elderly veteran reaching into his pocket, as if the slightest misstep could send everything spiraling out of control. The silence was no longer neutral. It carried tension. It carried the sense that something was about to happen, even if no one could name it. At the edge of the crowd, a young mechanic froze. His name was Lucas Reed. He was not looking at Cole. He was not looking at Henry. His eyes were locked on the A-10 behind them, on the small number painted along its fuselage 780618. A detail most people dismissed as a lifeless technical marking. But to Lucas, it was not just a number. In his mind, old fragments began to move. Dry training briefings. Side stories passed quietly around the hangar. One specific A-10. One specific pilot. A call sign that never appeared in official paperwork, yet anyone who had learned long enough had heard it. Then his gaze dropped to the patch on Henry's jacket, the Sand Scorpion. Faded. Non-regulation. Belonging to no official unit. The pieces fell into place. Lucas swallowed hard. His heart quickened not from fear, but from the realization that he was witnessing a serious mistake. A mistake no ordinary apology could fix. He scanned the faces around him. No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they were not certain enough to act. Lucas stepped back. Then another step. He pulled out his phone. He did not call security. He did not follow the familiar chain of command. He understood that doing so would only make things worse. Instead, he called someone else, someone who understood that some things are not written on shoulder boards or name tags, yet weigh more than all of them combined. Up front, Henry remained exactly as he was. His hand stayed inside his jacket. Nothing was pulled out hastily. No gesture was made to calm the crowd. He did not need to. He had stood in moments where a single unnecessary movement could mean someone would not make it home. Compared to those days, this was merely another test, one of dignity, not survival. Cole stared. He waited. He waited for a sign that he still held control. But the longer he waited, the more he felt something slipping away. Not because Henry resisted, but because too many people were watching. And somewhere beyond sight, an invisible wheel had begun to turn slowly, steadily. And when the call connected, when the story began to move beyond the reach of a single captain and toward those who understood the value of memory, the balance of power in that space quietly began to shift. The sound of a command vehicle cut through the taut air, sharp enough to draw every eye in the same direction. The SUV came to a hard stop, needing no explanation. No one signaled. No one asked the crowd to move aside. Its arrival carried authority on its own. The door opened. Colonel Michael Grant, the base commander, stepped out. He did not look around to assess the situation. He did not ask questions. He did not exchange quick words with subordinates. He walked straight ahead, passing Ryan Cole as if the captain did not exist. Not a glance. Not a word. That dismissal weighed heavier than any public reprimand. Cole froze. In that moment, he realized he had lost control. Not because he had been stopped, but because no one needed him to resolve this anymore. Grant stopped in front of Henry Walker. He drew himself upright. Unhurried. Unshowy. Then he snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. The motion was precise, unmistakable, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It was a salute, not for age, not for present rank, but for something far deeper. Mr. Walker Grant said, his voice clear and carrying loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It is an honor to have you on my flight line." Every murmur died instantly. No one moved. Those who had just witnessed the tension stood straighter without being told. A few young airmen adjusted their posture without realizing it. Not because of an order, but because they understood they were standing in the presence of something that demanded respect. Henry looked at Colonel Grant. He showed no surprise, no visible surge of emotion. He simply gave a small nod, familiar, restrained, the kind of acknowledgement exchanged by those who had spent years within chains of command. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. In their world, that salute had already said everything. Grant lowered his hand and then turned to the crowd. His eyes moved across each face, not harsh, not raised in volume, yet enough to make everyone understand they had just witnessed something that could not be dismissed. He did not need a long explanation. His presence and where he chose to stand made everything clear. Cole swallowed. He shifted slightly to the side, suddenly smaller within the very uniform he wore. No one criticized him. No one repeated his words back to him. Yet the invisible distance between him and everyone else could no longer be bridged. He realized too late that some boundaries are not written into regulations, and once crossed, they cannot be undone. Grant turned back to Henry. "Sir," he said, his voice lower now, but no less formal, "we are honored to have you here today." This was not courtesy. It was recognition from one commander to another who had once carried similar responsibility under far harsher conditions. Henry let out a quiet breath. Not relief, but acceptance. He did not need protection, but he did not refuse recognition when it was offered in the right way. For him, what mattered was not who had been right or wrong, but that the memory of those who had passed through war was not placed beneath the trivialities of the present. The crowd remained still. No one left. They sensed this was not the end, only the turning point. A door had just opened, leading toward a truth larger and deeper, waiting to be spoken aloud. And as every gaze settled on the elderly veteran standing beside the A-10, as power shifted places, without a word, his true identity was about to be spoken, not as an introduction, but as a reminder. Major Henry Walker. Colonel Grant said, his voice clear, unemphasized, yet carrying every word to those listening. Call sign Iron Vulture. The name fell into the crowd like a heavy object. Not everyone understood it at once, but those who had served long enough felt the difference immediately. Grant did not pause. He turned and pointed toward the A-10, standing silently behind Henry. This aircraft, tail number 7806118. He stopped for a brief beat. He flew it for over 2,000 hours. The crowd straightened. No one was told to. No order was given. It was a natural reaction when people realized they were standing before something greater than themselves. The numbers did not need embellishment. They carried their own weight. Grant continued, his tone steady, each sentence placed carefully. During Operation Desert Storm, he said he destroyed more enemy armored targets than any pilot in this wing's history. There was no murmuring, no doubt. The way he spoke did not sound like boasting. It sounded like the recitation of a truth long accepted. Grant turned toward Cole. This time his gaze held, not with anger, not with heaviness, but with the severity of someone who understood the consequences of treating history lightly. And the patch you just mocked, he said slowly, was given to him by an Army Rangers commander. Grant paused, letting the words settle. That commander's entire platoon made it home because this man did not turn away. No one laughed anymore. No one looked to anyone else for a reaction. The half-hearted laughter from moments before had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. Cole stood still. He said nothing. There were no words left that fit. The phrases he had used earlier returned to him now in a different form, heavier, irreversible. Henry remained motionless. He did not nod. He did not deny or add anything. What had just been said was not something he needed to prove. He had lived long enough to know that truth does not require a raised voice to defend it. It stands on its own when someone has the courage to place it where it belongs. Grant turned back to the crowd. He is not standing here as a lost visitor, he said. He is standing beside the very aircraft that carried him through days many others did not return from. His voice was not loud, but every word carried a reminder. And that deserves respect. A few young airmen swallowed hard. They did not know how to respond to the truth now laid bare. Not because it was distant, but because it was close. Close enough to reveal the gap between what they now enjoyed and what had once been paid to make it possible. Grant looked at Henry one more time. Sir, he said, his voice lower, thank you for what you did and for what you never spoke of. Henry gave a slight nod. Not to accept praise, but to close a chapter that had just been opened. There was no applause, no cheers. Recognition arrived in silence, fitting the way men like Henry had served their entire lives. The crowd understood that in this moment the lesson had been delivered. No further orders were needed. No public punishment required. The truth had been placed on the table, and it had done enough. And as the final word settled, as honor was returned to its rightful place, the question was no longer who had been right or wrong, but how each person would carry this lesson forward as they moved on. Cole lowered his head, not because he was forced to, but because he understood he had gone too far. There was no defense, no explanation light enough to erase what had just happened. His silence spoke for him heavier and more exposed than any apology could have been. Colonel Grant did not circle the issue. His voice was cool, precise, never raised. You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning. He paused for a beat. In full service uniform. No one needed to ask why. No one doubted the consequence. This was not a sentence, it was a reminder of the responsibility that comes with wearing rank. Cole gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Two short words that for the first time carried none of his earlier confidence. Only the late realization that rank does not shield a person from their own mistakes. Then Henry spoke. His voice was low and steady, neither interrupting nor competing. He's young, Colonel. The words surprised a few people. Henry did not look at Cole. He looked toward the A-10. He sees rank. He paused. He hasn't learned to see memory yet. Grant turned to Henry. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He understood that at this moment, there were things only someone who had lived through war could say without causing further harm. Henry continued his tone, even never lecturing. Respect isn't about who you salute. He spoke slowly, each word placed with care. It's about who you remember. His eyes rested on the aircraft's fuselage, and remembering why they're no longer standing here. No one spoke. Not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to add. Those words were not aimed at Cole alone. They were meant for everyone listening, a reminder that the uniform is not only a symbol of the present, but a promise to the past. Grant nodded. Not in agreement, but in recognition of the truth just spoken. This lesson, he said, turning toward Cole, is not meant to diminish you. It's meant to remind you that authority doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from understanding whose shoulders you're standing on. Cole lifted his head. His eyes no longer avoided anyone's gaze. I understand, sir. This time the words were not reflex. They carried acceptance, painful but necessary. Henry let out a quiet breath. Not because the tension had dissolved, but because he knew he had said enough. He was not seeking forgiveness for anyone nor offering it as a gift. He had simply placed a mirror in front of those who were younger and let them see themselves within it. The crowd remained still. No one hurried away. They understood that this moment was no longer about a captain or a veteran. It was about how each person would move forward after hearing what had just been said. Some lessons do not need to be repeated through orders. They stay through silence and through the hard-to-name weight that settles in the chest. Grant looked at Henry one last time. Thank you, sir. Henry nodded. No more, no less. To him, forgiveness was not about excusing mistakes, but about giving others the chance to grow beyond them. And as the conflict closed in humility, the story did not end there. It moved quietly into what remained, where memory becomes legacy, and legacy continues to live through those who stay behind. Cole was reassigned. No announcement, no debate, no lengthy explanation was offered. Just a clean, decisive decision reflecting how the institution handles mistakes that strike at the core of its values. For Cole, it was not a loud ending, but a necessary pause. He left quietly, carrying a lesson no academy could ever fully teach. Beneath the cockpit of the A-10, a bronze plaque was mounted. No fanfare, no embellishment. It bore only the name Henry Walker and a set of neatly engraved numbers. Flight hours, missions flown. Dry facts, yet enough to tell the story of a life that passed through war without needing praise. Nothing was bolded, nothing explained. Those who understood, understood. Henry stood before the plaque for a long time. Not to relive his achievements, but to be certain that memory had been placed where it belonged. To him, legacy was not about how often one's name was spoken, but whether those who came after still had the chance to learn from it. When he turned away, it was because there was nothing left he needed to leave behind. The most important things had been said in the simplest way. A few weeks later, in a small coffee shop outside the base, Cole found Henry. No uniform, no formal distance, just two men at very different stages of life. Cole stood at the table, hesitated for a moment, then spoke a single sentence, his voice low and steady. Thank you for your service. No excuses, no long apology, just a late but sincere acknowledgement. Henry looked up. He met Cole's eyes, then nodded. Nothing more. For him, respect did not need to be prolonged. It only needed to arrive at the right moment in the right way. Cole walked away lighter, stepping into a new path, with an understanding he had never possessed before. On the flight line, Lucas stood with a group of new mechanics. He did not tell the story as an anecdote meant to impress. He told it slowly in the voice of someone who knew he was passing on something greater than a single event. He spoke of an elderly veteran, of an A-10, of a sand scorpion patch, and of the moment. An entire base realized that power does not lie in the loudest voice, but in the memory preserved the longest. The younger ones listened, not because they were told to, but because they felt the weight of the story. They looked at the aircraft differently now. No longer just metal and specifications, but the imprint of people who had placed their lives inside it so others could make it home. Henry did not return to the base often. He did not need to. His legacy did not depend on constant presence. It was already there quietly, just as he had lived and served. Every time someone paused before the bronze plaque, every time a young person asked why certain numbers did not need to be highlighted, the story was told once more. And in that way, quiet courage continues to live. Not through speeches, not through grand ceremonies, but through small moments when people choose to remember instead of forget. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,